make them more user-friendly, encourage people to use the web by making government services more valuable to them on the web. And then you can get the goal of both encouraging broadband and, not coincidentally, providing better government services. So that could be a win-win. With that, I think I've exhausted my time.
Okay, thank you, James. Batting cleanup is Larry Darby, who's a senior fellow at the American Consumer Institute. Wait, did you get a discount on lunch, Steve? Because we got a lot of senior fellows up here. Did I read your bio right? You were former chief economist, but also former bureau chief at the Common Carrier Bureau?
Of the bureau. Mm-hmm. At that time, the FCC did not have a chief economist.
Oh,
I was chief of the economics division.
Ah, okay. But were you also chief of the Common Carrier Bureau?
Yes, sir.
They trusted an economist with that?
Temporarily.
Congratulations.
I held it between lawyers. Actually, between an engineer and a lawyer. Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and time's short, and notwithstanding Jerry's sense of humor, he has a taser in his pocket he's decided that he would use on us. There's an advantage and disadvantage for being the cleanup speaker. There's not a lot to clean up, actually, because much of what I heard I agree with, and I'm going to have to resist the temptation of sort of starting the debate early. As you know, recent notices by the FCC, NTIA, and RUS raise a whole lot of questions. Somebody took the time to count them, and there's something like 1,400 or 1,500 different kinds of questions. And when I try to answer the questions, I find that each one of them sort of morphs into or segues into 4 or 5 others. And that's sort of good news and bad news. It says that the inquiry is universal. But my concern is that the resolution of even small issues like definitions. Somebody mentioned what is broadband. Somebody mentioned what is discrimination. Somebody mentioned net neutrality. My concern is, that all of the energy, all the intellectual energy will be used up in debating important but minor issues, and we'll forget to keep our eye on the ball on major issues. It seems to me that success demands that we focus on the big ones. And having resolved the big ones, I think a lot of the smaller ones will kind of resolve themselves. In that context, in the next few minutes, I want to focus on what I regard to be 4 or 5 big ticket items. I'm guessing that many of you will disagree with my selection of the items. So be it. But I urge you, to the extent that you disagree with my items, that you try to formulate in your own mind, what do you think the government ought to be thinking about as it polls the public for opinions on these issues. My items: 1, how to divide responsibility and authority between public and private sector. 2, the importance of recognizing imperfections in both markets and in regulatory processes. 3, the need to focus on what both government and markets can do well and what they cannot do well. 4, the need to appreciate, and this may be the only new point I'm making here, because of, I guess, my background as an investment banker, the need to appreciate the enormous capital required to build out a truly broadband national network, point number 1. And related to that, how does government create the incentives and the opportunities for that capital to be generated? Finally, the importance, I think, of an accurate and coherent consumer perspective. But let me elaborate on that. The overriding questions are how the National Broadband Plan divides and assigns responsibility between the public and the private sector. What role for government, what role for private sector, for collective action, for command, demand, for incentives, and how to blend those. We don't really have a very good clue, and quite frankly, history suggests that we don't do that very well. I can't overemphasize the importance of these questions because they are in fact implicated or infused in every one of the other questions that have been addressed here so far. It seems to me that it's critical to move the debate beyond simple things like regulation versus deregulation, free market versus government command, liberalism versus conservatism, and indeed morality versus immorality. I've been accused of both, and we'll have to see how it works out. We should debate the facts and the details of government and market performance. Markets are not imperfect, we're told that all the time, but government institutions are also imperfect. If you doubt either of those propositions, you've not been reading the newspapers or watching cable network news lately. We should all try to keep the debate focused on how best to blend and harmonize the strengths of two very different but complementary institutions. We need them both. We need government, we need market. In that overall context, I want to call your attention to 4 questions whose answers I think will substantially drive the evolution of a national broadband strategy. First, we need to focus on what can government do and what can it do well. It seems to me that the government can do well by articulating national goals and then taking care to assure that its actions are consistent with that goals. Jerry, my time at the Commission, we never signed a single order that did not have some sort of consideration of the impact on universal service. I think we need to think about that. The Commission and all forms of government, all sorts of government, do all sorts of things that have a dramatic impact on the broadband goal, which impacts never get considered in the normal routine of business. Somebody mentioned spectrum available. The government must absolutely make broadband wireless spectrum available if we're to develop a third path to the home. It can create a structure of incentives and constraints that encourage good conduct, market conduct, and discourage bad conduct. And you can find both good and bad examples in the post-FCC behavior after the Act of 1996. Somebody mentioned creating a favorable tax climate. I resisted the temptation to stand up and shout, "Amen, amen." If you take a look at how states and local jurisdictions are taxing broadband networks, you'll find out, I have 2 minutes left, thank you, you'll find out that they're taxed at about twice the rate of sin taxes on other forms. Something needs to be done about that. Well, where will the money come from? Who will pay for the enormous capex required to build networks? It's not going to come from the government, and I think that's a bad idea. It's going to come from the private sector, and you can't squeeze it out of the private sector. You have to incent it out of the private sector. I resisted giving you a lecture from my class on corporate finance on the relationship between government incentives and investment, but if anybody's interested, I'll be happy to bend your ear about that. What drives or incents private sector investment? Think about, my thought here was to think about your own 401ks. Would you invest in broadband networks? If yes, why? If no, why not? And if not, why not? What would it take? What would you like to see the government do to induce you to invest? Because much of your 401k, your insurance, all of that, much of that is managed by people who are going to make a decision about whether to invest or not to invest. I think the Commission ought to be aware of that. Finally, what role for consumer welfare analysis? Steve and I were gratified to see a sizable section in the FCC NOI that explicitly addressed consumer welfare. It might seem trite to do so, but the fact is that consumer welfare is often given lip service by the Commission and by everybody who files at the Commission, but the sorry truth is that neither effectively advances or has been in recent years consumer welfare. I could cite a whole bunch of flaws favoring one consumer group over another, which basically is a redistribution rather than an efficiency strategy, weighing short-term benefits instead of long-term, casually accepting critical and casual acceptance of unsupported assertions about consumer welfare, and I could go on and on. So I think we should, wherever possible, and to this extent I agree with others who've mentioned this before, we should let consumers decide. We should not have government making these decisions. Consumers are not sovereign when government strips them of choices of service and rate packages or forces them into one-size-fits-all solutions. Secondly, when government decides on behalf of consumers, it is imperative that it do so with the benefit of full information about what consumers really want and what consumers really prefer. Seems simple enough, but quite frankly, I'm not sure we're on the right track in that regard.